Welcome back to Fresh Outlook, everybody. In his last State of the Union address, President Barack Obama urged voters to bridge the great divide in American politics. But at the GOP debate just days later, there was no evidence of anybody on the other side easing up on their fiery anti-Obama rhetoric. I am joined by our guest today on Fresh Outlook, David Goodman, a representative in the New Jersey chapter, Alain Sanders, a political science professor, and Reverend Dr. Forrest Pritchett. And we have some sound to show you right now of President Barack Obama in his State of the Union address. Let's play that down.
I know some of you answered to get back to Iowa. The United States of America, right now, has the strongest, most durable economy in the world. Anyone claiming that America's economy is in decline is peddling fiction. We have to make college affordable for every American. I'm guessing we won't agree on health care anytime soon. But there should be other ways parties can work together to improve economic security. The United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth, period. Priority number one is protecting the American people and going after terrorist networks. ISIL will learn the same lessons as terrorists before them. If you doubt America's commitment, or mine, to see that justice is done, just ask Osama bin Laden. When politicians insult Muslims, whether abroad or our fellow citizens, it diminishes us in the eyes of the world. It makes it harder to achieve our goals. It betrays who we are as a country. I believe we've got to reduce the influence of money.
All right, now just days after President Obama gave that State of the Union address and said everything's looking great, Walmart announces that they're going to close nearly 300 stores in the United States. JCPenney is closing stores. Sears is closing stores. Macy's is closing stores. The stock market is off to its worst start in history. For January. We saw American soldiers on the day that the president spoke on their knees at the hands of Iranian soldiers. I would say that this country is in as bad shape or worse shape than it was when President Obama took office.
Gee, that sounds like a great introduction for Donald Trump, Logan. but I would say this. What he also said, and I think that needs to be emphasized, is that this country, the world in fact, Western economies are going through remarkable change. There's going to be a lot of dislocation, and some of the examples that you've just cited, the store closings, the situation with people not feeling that they're earning a just wage for their work, I think this is all expressions of this. This is a very difficult and volatile time that we're living in right now, and I think therefore it allows for something of a paradox. You can talk about the fact that we have recovered substantially from the Great Recession of 2008, but there's a great sense abroad that the majority of Americans aren't participating in this, are not really benefiting. Those two realities are coexisting together.
I think it's interesting, I'll let you make your point, Alan, in just a second, that progressives have been so anti-Walmart. They should be unionized, their workers should be paid more, their workers aren't treated right. Big oil in this country should be taken down to its knees. Well, now we're seeing what's going to happen if big oil is brought to its knees. All of us suffer. If Walmart is put out of business, minimum wage workers will go from making minimum wage to nothing. So there is a double-edged sword. Be careful what you wish for, Alan.
Well, there's always a double-edged sword, but I think what you're really seeing is, and listening to the president, is sort of his farewell address. If you listen to George Bush's last State of the Union, that was his farewell address, and we all remember that the Bush administration didn't end on a very good note. It almost led to a depression, which Barack Obama inherited. So what you're seeing is sort of the farewell address, and it's always going to be high praise. Now, in terms of this being a difficult time, we're always living through difficult times. There's always a contradiction. Some people are doing well, some people are doing bad. The glass is always half full or half empty. What struck me about that speech, however, was the fact that it really sounded a lot more like a fireside chat. If you took away the trappings, if you just put Barack Obama in the chair and in a sweater in front of a chimney, it sounded like a fireside chat. And that to me suggested that that was the real Barack Obama. And had he adopted that kind of posture, as opposed to sort of the eloquent rhetoric that sounded wonderful because of its eloquence, but didn't really amount to much, if he had done that at the start of his presidency, my guess is he would have had a much more successful presidency, because it would have resonated with the people a lot more when his approval ratings were high. Now, at the end of 8 years, or nearly 8 years, it doesn't resonate the same way, because people have all their problems, and they point to Barack Obama as being partly responsible for those problems. But that kind of speech at the beginning would have been a highly successful speech.
I don't agree, by the way.
Let me get Dr. Pritchett in on
sure,
the conversation. Yeah. What is your take on the State of the Union in the year 2016 and the Obama presidency overall?
I think the speech itself also accomplished the fact that it may be setting out for the candidates in 2016 the parameters for their additional dialogue, number one. I think, number two, that his presidency, ultimately in time, not right away, will be seen as one of the great presidencies, only in that when you look at his policy, legislative, the initiatives that were developed. It's very true. I think that right now we're living through a kind of a maze and a cloud that has attempted to really interfere and define his presidency from the outside. But ultimately, I would think that historians will show us that, given the weight of everything that was passed during his time, that it will be one of the great presidencies.
I don't agree with Alan, but I think Dr. Pritchett characterized it correctly. This wasn't Barack Obama's farewell address. We'll get that at the end of the calendar year. What this was the first address of 2016 of his campaign. Sure, he's not running on the ballot, but he's going to be campaigning aggressively for whomever the Democratic nominee is for president. So this was not a farewell address by any means. The entire thing was to set a tone for the 2016 campaign. We'll see what he has to say about a wrap-up probably in December or even January of next year.
Has President Obama, Alan, accomplished anything since the Affordable Care Act was passed? I feel like every piece of legislation he has proposed has been either stymied or denied by Congress.
Well, I think he did accomplish a lot, but most of what he accomplished was a long time ago, in the first 2 years of his presidency,
right,
when he had a Democratic Congress. So he did get Obamacare through. He also saved the auto industry. He also brought the United States back from a perilous economic situation that could have led to a depression that was far worse than we experienced. He changed the rules and regulations pertaining to women's rights and pertaining to abortion. He appointed two important members of the United States Supreme Court, young voices that hopefully, if a Democratic administration continues, he expects those voices to result in a majority. So just looking at those things, those are major accomplishments. Obamacare is here to stay. Obamacare probably needs to be reformed, as any major piece of legislation needs to be reformed. But he's looking at a successor, a Democratic successor, and if one comes along, if one is elected, then Obamacare is here to stay. It's also not clear what would happen to Obamacare if a Republican administration came along, because it's not clear that they would want to repeal all aspects of Obamacare, because a lot of people have come to depend on certain portions of it. So he's accomplished a lot on health, on the economy, and on women's rights. And also,
and gay rights as well.
And gay rights as well, absolutely. So yes, he has accomplished a lot.
He's had to do a lot of things in the midst of resistance from Congress through executive order. I mean, he's had to do things on the environment, the efforts that he's made in Paris in terms of the climate change treaty, the nuclear Iran deal. I mean, you may not like all these features, and you may not like the way they were achieved, but the fact is, I think he's got a long list of achievements. I think as a historian, it's too soon to make a judgment as to his greatness or lack of greatness. Usually you give somebody a 10 to 20 year window, but certainly not something that we can judge today. I think when people look a little more dispassionately on the accomplishments, Logan, I think they're going to be impressed with the litany of things that he's done.
With one big caveat, and I think the reason many people are uncomfortable and why he's getting a lot of criticism is on the national security issue. If you look at around the world, globally, the Middle East is in fire. It's on fire in all aspects of its political situation. And then, of course, there is terrorism.
And that's been the case, though, for decades,
so
honestly, though.
That's
but although
true.
it seems worse now under ISIS.
That's true, but it seems worse. Certainly ISIS is a much more
greater threat
abominable
than any other
organization than before.
Yeah.
So if you look at the world scene and the images that are pervading the media, the violence and the chaos that pervades the world, that I think is impacting people's assessment of him. And I think you saw that in the Republican debate. That's where they hammered the hardest on the Obama administration on the question of national security.
We're going to switch to the GOP debate in just a second, but I want to give Dr. Pritchett a final word on the Obama legacy and how you see that he will be viewed decades from now.
As I said a little bit earlier, I believe that he will be seen as a pioneer in the area of advancing racial imagery in general in the American psyche. I was very curious when the Affordable Care Act was introduced and all of the hullabaloo began. How I was curious how when the Social Security concept was introduced, how was it received? So I went back and started looking, and it really took years of arguing and debating before that was hammered out. And look at how we embrace and enjoy it today. So I believe that's going to be the course of life, if you would, for the Affordable Care Act.
We could say the same thing about Medicare, too.
Yes,
LBJ
yeah.
got a lot of resistance to that, and it had to be, I think Alan's right. You have to tinker and reform with the basic concept because these big, massive bills are introduced. It's almost a blunderbuss approach, and then you have to go step back and make them more workable. Unfortunately, the opposition that he's getting, or the concept that Obamacare is getting from the Republicans is not helpful, I think, in terms of reforming it rather than discarding it.
Well, it's interesting you say that because let's turn now to the GOP debate, and they're not talking about, they're talking about discarding it and replacing it when it comes to Obamacare. My take on the GOP debate from the other night is that there are three viable contenders: Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio. And from looking at their debate performance, I would have to say Trump is probably going to be the nominee. I know everybody bristled at this idea back in the summer and said he is going away. He is just a sideshow. But now I think he is going to win the GOP nomination. I said that before. I've got a dinner bet riding on it with one of our
I was
guests.
here when you made it.
Yeah, exactly. So is Trump here to stay? David, I'll start with you, then work our way
Well,
around.
I can't resist saying, thanks for that introduction, that my good friend Alain Sanders and I were on this show this summer, and Alan's exact words were that Donald Trump is summer theater. That's a direct quote. It's a direct quote, and he was good. I took the contrarian view, and I'll give myself a pat on the back. I was right. Whether he's the ultimate nominee or not, I'm not sure, but I do know one thing, Logan. He is fracturing, he may even be destroying the Republican Party as we've known it throughout our lives. I mean, Peter Wehner, who's a Republican operative through 3 Republican administrations, wrote an op-ed piece this week in the New York Times saying, "I will not vote for Donald Trump." And he gave an entire series of reasons for not doing that, including the fact that he said his nomination will destroy the Republican Party as we've known it. What's happened here is that pitchfork populism, which the Republican establishment played with, they've been playing with fire for the last, this goes back to George H.W. Bush and the Willie Horton problem. They've been playing with fire for the last 20 years.
So they've been going extremely far right in order to curry the conservative branch. And they've created a monster that's now gotten out into the field, and they can control it. I said this a month ago when I was on this show. The Republican leadership of the establishment is petrified of the fact that they've lost control. Whether it's Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, they represent real threats to the Republican Party as the establishment has known it.
Yeah, he is summer theater, and like all good summer shows, sometimes they get renewed for the fall.
So this has an extended run.
But you are right. No, he is summer theater.
Alan won't give up.
What has happened is he is summer theater. But what has happened is sometimes a summer show can tap into a entertainment vein, but in this instance, a political vein. And so I do agree with you that he's struck into a populist vein. And for the Republican Party, that is very dangerous because the populist vein is a vein that goes in two general directions. One is against the establishment, whatever the establishment happens to be, which within the Republican Party is the business wing of the party. And populism also has a racist tinge to it. If you take a look at it historically, it's been a racist tinge. Now, the good news about populism is that sometimes it morphs into progressivism, as happened in the early 20th century. And the progressivism right now is being, the banner of progressivism is being flown by Bernie Sanders. So what you're seeing are two historical movements from the late 19th, early 20th century, modernized and brought up to this period. So the summer theater has brought forth populism, okay? And populism is for real, it's not summer theater. But now what we have to see is, what does it do to the Republican Party? Will it tear it asunder? Will the Republican Party take hold of it and mold it into progressivism, or will progressivism be the movement of the Democratic Party?
Here's I'm going to get Dr. Pritchett in on this just now, but here's a mistake I think you're making, Alan, is that you're mistaking Donald Trump for an ideologue. He is not. He is an opportunist who is simply spewing whatever rhetoric is needed to secure the nomination. But this man is a moderate, if not liberal, if you look at his record.
Sure.
But Dr. Pritchett.
No, I was going to just put in my point of analysis on that first question. The first time I voted was in the fall of 1964 as a 21-year-old under the old rules. I was a senior in college at the time. I worked in Atlantic City that summer when the Democratic Convention was held. And I can recall this gigantic billboard that was set up by the Republican Party that stretched out into the ocean from one of the amusement piers and had a picture of Barry Goldwater with the blue background and bunting saying, "In your heart, you know he's right." So my parallel would be to pull that up. So we get the LBJ and with the party of the people going against this guy who said, you know, we're going to straighten out America for once and for all. And the result of that election was LBJ won by a landslide.
Right.
So given what was presented to America at that point, I'm only looking forward to a similar landslide in November.
This could be, that's a good analogy, although I would equally say this could be the George McGovern moment for the Republican Party.
The problem, though, is Hillary Clinton, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, is a horrible candidate because she is anti-charismatic. And I'm going to give you all a final thought to give you 10 seconds each on your predictions for the 2016 presidential election.
I don't think we can be assured anymore that Hillary Clinton's necessarily going to be the nominee.
Agree.
The debate that's going to occur on Sunday, Bernie Sanders is going to have to step up his game in terms of going on the attack, which is contrary to his commitment to not going negative. But he has a real opportunity to win in Iowa and New Hampshire, and that could change the whole dynamic.
She will lose again in Iowa.
Historically, your analysis doesn't hold up. In New Hampshire, the local candidate, whether that is to say a candidate from the New England area, always wins New Hampshire on the Democratic side. In Iowa, it's much more of a toss-up. So I'm not sure that focusing on New Hampshire and Iowa and the results there tell us very much about the progress of the Democratic race. If you take a look at the number of people who vote in Iowa and actually who caucus in Iowa and in New Hampshire combined, it is less than 1 million people. How we can make a prediction on 1 million people in a nation of 300 million astounds me.
It sets a tone, though. Dr. Pritchett.
I'm looking to see if indeed, no matter where we are in the fall, if we would have a woman, Hillary, to be the candidate, how would the sense of Americans thinking that they could make history by elevating the first woman, that would be an interesting model that I'm looking at this point.
Interesting comments by all. I think Bernie Sanders is going away. Nobody's going to vote for him. But I think Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden is going to step up, and I think Joe Biden's going to be the president.
A little charisma for Hillary, though. A little charisma for Hillary. Go ahead.
Sounds good. Thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughts on that. When we come back, we're going to look at another sideshow that takes center stage. The Oscar nominations are out. More on that after this.